Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly 90-minute deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
My name is Lisa. I'm a clinical psychologist and a college counselor. I am a parent of a boy in elementary school, a girl in middle school, and a girl in college. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, is college worth it? Usually, but not always. A great blog article in the Josiah Barlett Center for Public Policy blog by Andrew Cline. Our questions from a listener are, question 1, how to evaluate whether a school does better than its peers at looking after first-year students? That's Dave from Colorado. Our second question is, I attend a small school and two of my peers committed to Duke as athletic recruits. Will Duke consider taking 3 students from my small school, or will their commitments hurt my chances? And that is from Caitlin. Our interview is the final part, the 5th of 5 series, by Michael Ireland, the Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Smith College, and Courtney Blauvett, the Director of College Counseling at the Miss Hall School and a former financial aid counselor for 4 colleges. And they are answering 12 questions our listeners sent in about financial aid and paying for college. And there will be no college spotlight for this New Year's edition.
Friends, when Anika and I started the podcast back in October of 17, one thing we committed to at that time was never to have a commercial. And we did that for 2 reasons. One, we just despise commercials. Both of us, it's like one of our pet peeves. But also, as soon as you introduce a commercial, then there's always the potential that somebody could not like a particular thing that you say and can inhibit some of your freedom. Well, we've been able to do that because so many of you have been generous and helped us with a donation. And so if you're feeling charitable, benevolent at this Christmas season, we would really appreciate it. If it's something you want to do, we don't want anybody to give if this feels like someone's giving you a bill, then, don't give. If you're someone who loves to give, enjoys giving, enjoys supporting stuff you believe in, we'd be most grateful if you'd make a contribution to us with our expenses. So charitable gifts cover about 70% of all of our expenses, and we just eat the other 30% to just pay for it ourselves. And so you could give by going to yourcollegeboundkid.com, and you'll see the donate button. And once again, if there's something that you'd want to do, we would be most grateful if you, in the Christmas season, think about your college-bound kid. And Dave, I have to thank you. You've been one of our biggest supporters over the years. So I have to thank you, my friend.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a great ride.
All right. And I do want to say one last thing about that. When you do give, our thank you to you is extra content. We figure what better gift could we give you than content? And so once a month, you do get an extra audio blog between 10 to 15 minutes sent directly to your email. The most recent one for the month of December looks at 18 different colleges that have shared the difference between their acceptance rates with test scores and their acceptance rates without test scores. And so we look at that data, share it with you, and say, what inferences can we draw from this data? So that's the kind of thing that we sent you once a month, and for any gift of any size, and you get that in perpetuity. So it's just our way of saying thank you. All right, Dave, admissions tip.
Gotcha.
So I tweeted this a while ago, and I'm just going to read the tweet verbatim. Too many students who are deferred can't resist the urge to overstep appropriate boundaries by reaching out to admissions in ways that are a nuisance and only diminish their admissions odds. This smacks of desperation. Of course, it's human nature to do this, but please follow the guidance. In other words, that is something that admission offices hate. And I know there's the feeling like you feel like things are outside of your control. You got to do something. You got to have another recommendation. You got to call. Or worse yet, you got to have a parent call and say how amazing your child is. You know, you got to show up at the school or another visit or all these different things. That's generally going to be seen as a nuisance. Most schools will give you clear instructions. In fact, what I'm seeing even increasingly, Dave, is more and more schools are being very, very emphatic. Please do not, and they'll say, like, please do not send in another recommendation. Please do not call us. Or please, they lay out exactly what their policy is. And I know it's hard, but the best thing to do is if you're still interested, follow their policy. Nothing more, nothing less.
The classic, don't call us, we will.
Well, sometimes there's schools that, look, they're going to ask you, do you want to, is your interest still there? And most schools will say that. Let us know if you still want to be considered. And there's a process for going online and doing that at most schools. And at some school, and look, it's different for every single school. There are schools that will say, send a paragraph and reaffirm why you're still interested. But you just got to read the fine print is the rules here. Read the fine print because it's different for everybody. All right, Dave, this is the first admissions vernacular for 2000.
Wow. Okay.
22. By the way, Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Hopefully 2022 will be the best year ever.
Yeah, let's just say we're not coming off a best year ever. That's right.
I just want to get away from COVID.
That's right.
So let's see if you can come out of the gates going 1 for 1.
That's right.
The term is reach for all. What does reach for all mean?
I know that one. Now you got me an easy one for the New Year's. It means that some institution is so competitive that no matter if you are the second coming of Einstein, it's still not a guarantee. It's literally a reach for all.
See, I had to start out magnanimous at the start of the year. You got it, my friend. And, it could be confusing because I literally have 7 terms that I use, to describe the same thing. So sometimes I will refer to these schools as unlikelies. Sometimes I will refer to them as long shots. Sometimes I will refer to them as lottery schools. Sometimes I will refer to them as wild cards. Sometimes I will refer to them as highly rejectives. And sometimes I refer to them as reach for alls. And some people call them far reaches. So that's, I know this is why it's so complicated, right? A zillion terms. Because Swiss Army knife, you pull out the right term at the right time. If I'm trying to shake somebody out of their complacency because I feel they're just totally clueless as to what, the reality of their chances are, then I might refer to it as a lottery school. But that's such a loaded term that I'd use that only about 1 in 100 times. But that's the bottom line. Some schools, no matter how competitive you are as a candidate, it's a reach for everybody. And the best thing that you can do in these cases is apply, and apply with confidence. Do your absolute best on your application, but literally put yourself in the mindset of not expecting to get in. So it's tricky because you don't want to write your application, I'm not getting in, so then you just do it half-heartedly. You go, you do it you give it your best, but you literally want to put yourself in the mindset, to use an example, it'd be much better. Let's say you believe in Santa Claus and it's Christmas. I'm going way back to those days. Be much better to convince yourself that, Santa Claus isn't coming. There are not going to be any presents, than to be expecting, 10, 20 presents and you come down and there's nothing under the tree. Trying to keep it in the Christmas season, Dave.
Yeah, but I'm not so sure it's reassuring that you're comparing their chances to a mythical figure.
Work with me on this one.
Childhood dreams and hopes that we always
I'm trying to prolong the Christmas season. New Year's is here, but I'm trying to reach back and grab last week.
In other words, you've got as much chance as getting in as Santa Claus dropping the gift. I don't think that helps too much.
Okay, I'll work on my illustrations.
But I think
I'll try to upgrade them for 2022.
I will say that one of the best things you've ever told me is that the best way to improve your college happiness is to simply expand your definition of a good school, and that reaches only become reaches if you're limiting your choice. But if you expand your definition of success to the many, many, many good schools that are well within your wheelhouse, then it doesn't become a reach anymore. It's like within these group of schools.
I mean, that is so true.
Yeah.
And I've realized when I was listing all the synonyms I use, I forgot one of my favorite ones, the one percenters. You know, if you're looking at the one percenters, 25 hardest schools in the country to get into, then they're going to be a reach for all, no matter how, and the best thing you can possibly do. I'm not saying you should not apply to the one percenters, because some people quite honestly should if they're that strong. And there's lots of students I'll recommend them to if you're that strong. But the best thing you can do is what you're saying is recognize that the 5 and the 10 and the 20 percenters are also fantastic schools, and embrace them. And this is hard, embrace them equally. Don't assume because a school's harder to get into, that makes it a better school. That's a myth, and that's a very, very prevalent myth, and it creates a lot of problems out here. And, if somebody feels like, I kind of heard you say this before, what I talk about in this podcast is what I encounter in my counseling. That's what you get. You get an overflow of my experiences. That's what causes me to prioritize certain things and not other things. So if you hear me coming back to some repeated themes, it's because these things are so prevalent in the counseling load that I feel they cannot be emphasized enough. And I got an email from someone recently, and they said, you've really helped me to see that a lot of the schools that we were looking at are probably not realistic. And I feel so happy, because I'm like, okay, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to dash dreams, but I am trying to keep it real. All right, Dave, the big number is 1,100.
1,100.
And 1,100 is how many cases of COVID broke out at Cornell in a very, very short period of time. All right, Dave, take it away.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Well, this is actually a great article. This is a good one to discuss. Is college worth it? Usually, but not always. And it's by Andrew Cline, writing on the Josiah Barlett Center for Public Policy blog. And what it was, there was a study done by a gentleman called Preston Cooper of the Foundation for Research and Economic Opportunity. And what that study found was that more than a quarter of college majors produce a negative return on investment. So first, let's define what he meant by negative return on investment. He said a lot of his studies have shown that STEM and business degrees pay better over the course of a person's career than degrees in psychology and education. But Cooper added to the debate by ranking degrees based on the financial return of a student's investment, not just his lifetime earnings. So what he said was that a degree's value was equal to the future earnings of the student minus the opportunity costs and the costs of attending college itself. And he defined the opportunity cost as the earnings that you gave up while in school and the earnings that you would have made in a course of career that did not involve college. So with this data, Cooper created a searchable database that lets students search nearly 30,000 programs at almost 1,700 colleges and universities. And what he found was there's a real difference, not just among degrees, but among the same degree at different institutions. So just to summarize some of the findings, and then we'll open it for discussion, he found that for most bachelor degrees, the return on investment, the median was about $300,000, but there was huge variation that some degrees were worth millions of dollars on return on investment, while other degrees actually had a negative return on investment. He found that accounting for the risk of dropping out, that the return on investment of an average bachelor degree dropped to $130,000, and that 25% of all degrees earned had a negative return on investment. And he found that the choice of major was more important than the choice of institution, and that major choice alone accounted for half of the variation in the return on investments. So, not surprising, the financial return on investment was much higher in engineering, computer science, nursing, and economics, and less in such majors such as music, religion, psychology, or education. He also found that if you graduated in 4 years, then that was much better. Only 16% of degrees had a negative return on investment. But if you increased your graduation to 5 or 6 years, 28% of those college degrees had a negative return on investment. And the last 2 points is that he said, interestingly, programs at the more expensive schools, which he defined as tuition over $12,000, had a higher return on investment than other schools, almost $200,000 as opposed to $130,000. But he found that attending an elite school was still no golden ticket, that there were over 100 programs at colleges with acceptance rates less than 20% that had a negative return on investment. Cline summarizes this article basically with an argument against free college because he said most degrees actually pay for themselves many times over, so there's no need to subsidize education. But he said that if you subsidized all degrees, particularly within a particular financial pursuit, then you're going to be subsidizing mediocre programs and preventing the market from either causing them to improve or to go out of business. And it was better to give the students the data on the worth of degrees that he's doing and let them decide for themselves. So that's a lot of information, Mark, but let me throw it open to you now.
No, but it provides a good foundation for people to understand our conversation. So I thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I have so many thoughts. My mind's like a piston just popping all over the place on this article. On one hand, I really appreciate the article because I think that for too long, people think that going to college is just an elixir. And you just go. And magic happens. And, it's funny. I don't know why, but I've had this conviction, Dave, since the time I was 18 or 19. Like, I can remember a conversation I was having with a student when I was at Michigan State in my sophomore year. And I remember saying to her, just because you graduated doesn't mean like the world opens up like this, the Red Sea parts. Like, you have to have a plan. What is your plan? How are you planning on using your degree to get you to go where you're trying to go? Because I just sort of thought she was just kind of drifting. Absolutely kept in touch with her, and unfortunately, it kind of did happen. So, years after she graduated, she was just doing, working, jobs like call center jobs and things like that. And she literally went back to get more specialized training in something that would be more marketable, and it's worked out for her. But so, there's a part of me that thinks this is good, having this kind of information, having this kind of data. I want people coming in knowing the ROI. I want people coming in knowing what, different majors, average pay, average compensation for different majors. I think that's very, very important. In fact, if you've heard my view on college debt, you have to know this. You need to take your first year projected income, look at the net pay from that first year projected income and take 80% of that, and that's your maximum loan debt. There's a big difference between somebody coming out making $90,000 and someone coming out making $30,000 in terms of how much loan debt they can sustain. So I'm all for that. I'm all for the data, and I'm glad to have that, and I love research like this. So that's one side of what I'm thinking. Another side of what I'm thinking is something you've said many times, Dave, which is college is not just about a job. It's about growing as a person. It's about learning how to think. It's about being stretched, being challenged, self-awareness as you interact with different people who think differently and expose you to different things, and forming your foundational views. So that's another thought that I have. Like, if there's a part of it that feels trite to limit everything simply to the careerism component of things. Another thought percolating in my mind is that I know people that have done very well financially in some of the majors that he described as not having good ROIs. You mentioned some of them. A couple others he mentions here are art and philosophy. So art, music, philosophy, religion, and psychology were 5 he really focused on that leave students financially worse off than if they'd never gone to college at all. Well, I can say myself, I'm a psychology major, undergraduate degree, and I'm, I know just purely financially, let alone all the other benefits. Every single job I've pretty much ever had ever since I've graduated, I've needed a college degree for it. And it's led to, infinite more earnings than I would have had I not had that. So part of me disputes the notion, because my concern is one size fits all. A lot of times people say, I don't want to major in art because it's dead end. You're not going to make any money. Well, I worked with on my previous original product, Game Changer. In fact, people, if they want, they can go to YouTube and put School Match for You in YouTube. And immediately when you put School Match for You in, you'll see this video that will pop up. And it's a video that I hired an artist to do, a professional artist, with all the sound effects. And one guy, when he saw this video, he wanted to give us $100,000 right away. He was so impressed toward this project, a businessman in Brunswick, Georgia. And Nika and I went down and met with him. And I say this because I got to know Nate, the guy who did the video, quite well. And he liked me, and he gave me a discounted price. He charged me $1,500 to produce it. But he said to me, my rate is normally $4,000 a day to do this, to work on this. And I charge corporate clients even more. And so why am I sharing the story? Because if you have a plan, here's a guy who majored in art, and he makes serious cheese. So it's not necessarily the case that just because you major in one of these things, if you have a plan and a strategy, that it can't lead to a financially lucrative career. So those are my thoughts. I've been rambling for a while. What do you think, Dave?
I want to bring out an illustration about college that was very helpful to me. And that was that college is simply a vehicle. It's a vehicle to get you from point A to point B. But like all destinations and journeys, you're going to be fundamentally much more successful if you know what your ultimate destination is. And so if you enter college knowing where you're headed, what you want to accomplish, where you want that car to take you, that's going to give you far greater return on investment. And so many of these degree programs that have these high return on investments, it's because they already have almost like a built-in destination. If you're going into computer engineering, a destination, even if you don't end up being a engineer, it's pointing you into engineering. It's pointing you into nursing. It's pointing you into, let's say, business or law or medicine. So you're working towards a goal that has a very defined destination. The problem is that many of these other degrees don't have built-in destinations. You have to create one by yourself. The fact is, if you're a music major and you end up being a concert pianist, that was a great return on investment. If you are a religion major and you end up being a pastor of a church, it doesn't matter what you earn. You're measuring your earnings based on spiritual criteria. So that was a great return on your investment. If you end up in education and you say, I want to educate kids, and I know that elementary kids teachers don't make a lot of money, but that's still a great return on investment because you're measuring your lifetime earnings on your impact on people's lives. So I think that this criteria only captures one element of that, and that if you have a destination in mind, you know where college is going to take you, then that's how you actually define the worth of the degree. People get into trouble when they go to college and they just don't know where it's going to take them, and so they can end up driving around in a circle. Does that make sense?
No, I agree 100% with every single thing you said there. Like if you are going to major in the arts, in the musics, in the philosophy, in the religions, in the psychology, you need to have a plan. You need to have a plan of how you're going to use that degree for your future. And you've covered a lot of different plans. Maybe your plan is that money's not that important in your value system and you're comfortable making less of an income and you're doing what you love and you're prepared to do that and live with the income that comes with that. Now, I would say, and this is where the article's good, if that's your path, then you really, really need to be careful about how much money you spend.
Right.
to get that, because there are cheaper ways to end up at the same place versus paying a ransom note to get a degree. So that's one side. But on the other hand, when you really do what you love, a lot of times when you do what you love, the money will come. And there are also a lot of fields out there. I'll give you one: sales. Sales doesn't care. They don't care what your degree is in. Professional sales wants you to have a college degree. It can be in theater, it can be in art, it can be in film, it can be something. They don't care. If you can sell and you've got a professional degree, a college degree from pretty much anywhere, that's usually the litmus test to get into professional sales. But then all that matters is, do you produce? So having that plan is essential. I do think knowing the statistics is helpful. So I think it's a helpful article. And like you said, if you're going to be, a data scientist or something, one of these higher paid professions, it'll just almost naturally come your way. You don't even almost need a plan. I mean, it's still good to have a plan for everybody. But yeah, nursing, places where supply and demand dynamics just work in your favor. Yeah, you'll actually get away without a plan from a financial standpoint. Still not prudent. But if you're in one of these other majors, you absolutely need to have a plan. And a lot of times your plan can be, that's my undergrad, and then I'm going to do what I love in my undergrad, and I'm planning on doing something else in grad school. Dave has often said to me, it's a competitive advantage as a medical school applicant not to be a biology major, not to be a biochemistry major, not to be a chemistry major. Zillions of people are doing that. You just go into the herd and you don't stand out. You're a lot more interesting if you're one of these other majors, like, political science or history, or name whatever it is, as long as you show that you have mastery on something I threw on you a few weeks ago, man, that BCPM GPA.
That's right. Biology, chemistry,
as long as you
physics.
show you can do well in biology and organic and inorganic chemistry, physics, math, do well on the MCAT and have good medical school experiences, hospitalization, volunteering, maybe some clinicals, shadowing, research, do all that, good references, good writing, good interview, you'll be more even interesting if you have these different backgrounds. So I think it's a really, really helpful article, because I think there is a problem of widespread naivete out there. There is a problem of thinking that just go to college and the Red Sea parts. And there are not enough people that have a plan of how they're going to use their degree for their future pursuits. And I think this is a little bit of a slap in the face and a little bit of a wake-up call for anybody who thinks, that's what they're going to do. Another thing that's interesting, and another thought that I had, Dave, is for all the obsession that so many parents and students have about trying to go to a prestigious institution, it does make you wonder, is that just about impressing those in your social circle? Or is that about what you think gets you ahead? Because the article makes it pretty clear, and so does other data. You'd be better going to, a state institution with a 90% acceptance rate and majoring in one of these high income professions from a financial standpoint than going to fancy smancy brand name U in most instances and getting a degree in a major that that doesn't have the earnings track record. And so why is there not more of a fixation on that as people think about college? It's just something we're thinking about.
Well, and I remember reading a study. I can't remember the exact percentage figure, but it was upwards close to 90% of Harvard people who got PhDs in the humanities from Harvard were not employed in the field in which they got their PhDs from. Now, that didn't mean that they were unemployed, so I want to imply that, but it just simply meant that just because you got a PhD in Russian studies doesn't mean that you're going to be a Russian studies major. You might end up working for the CIA. It's really hard to say. But I will say two things that do affect the return on investment that you talk a lot about, Mark, is number one, the cost of college. I think that's something that kids could really focus on. And you make this point. Don't get incredibly in debt no matter what college you could go to. If you can go to a decent college and end up with very little debt versus a great college and you end up at $250,000 in debt, that's going to hugely affect the return on your investment.
And, I'll say something about this. One thing quite a few of my parents have pointed out to me that I've worked with, and they're pretty savvy. And here's what they'll say, and I hear this pretty frequently from my parents. They'll say, it almost doesn't really matter where you go to undergrad. You can go to undergrad and get a good education, at a fraction of a price of compared to certain schools, do really, really well, and then write your own ticket in grad school. And if you want to go for the more prestigious brand name place, if you do it for grad school, it validates your undergrad. I'll never forget Dr. Edmonds, two dentists that I worked with very closely in Pennsylvania. Shout out to them. They became people I've kept in touch with and hold in high regard. But I remember Dr. Edmonds, Reg Edmonds, the dad, saying, I have 2 undergraduate degrees from places that nobody's heard of. One is Cheney, a small little HBCU in Pennsylvania. He said, but people look at where I got my 2 advanced degrees. In his case, one was Penn, one was Columbia, and it completely validates my other degrees. Nobody ever questions them. They're like, oh, if I've never heard of it, it must be a good place. Look where it got you. And so that's another thing is you look at the cost of college, not spending it all on undergrad, knowing that we're in a world now where grad school is almost, a grad degree is almost like the new bachelor's. A master's almost is like the new, bachelor's. I'm struggling over here, Dave. You think I'm the one who worked the graveyard shift, man, not you.
Well, that's what we call the
bachelor's.
I like that, bachelor's.
I'm trying to get my name Mark in there somehow. Give me a little credit, MA. The master's is the new bachelor's. So I think it's pretty smart when parents are like, I'm not breaking the bank for an undergrad degree when we still have the grad degree, especially because one thing that parents say that seem to understand is you don't have to go to designer undergrad to be really competitive at designer grad school. You really don't. You go in, they're looking for people that were successful at the environment they came out of.
Yeah.
So we're getting a little bit more into financial planning and getting probably a little away from the spirit of things. But I think it's a good article, and we'll put the link in the show notes. I would encourage you to read it. There's a lot of data in here that we didn't share. I think it's one of these articles that just makes people think and reflect.
I think so.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Lisa, we've got 2 great questions from 2 different listeners, one from a parent and one from a student, and no preamble today. Let's just dive in.
All right, here's question number 1. One of the big questions my wife and I have is how can you evaluate whether a big school does a better job than its peers in looking after its students? First-year retention is one metric, but that can also be a measure of affluence and GPAs or preparation of incoming students. And this question comes to us from Dave from Colorado.
Love this question. And this gives me an opportunity to talk about something I've wanted to talk about for a long time. When I first started doing college counseling in Pennsylvania, under the tutelage of Susan Tree, she used to talk about NASFAA all the time. And I don't think I've ever talked about NASFAA on the podcast. So NASFAA is an acronym for the National Survey of Student Engagement. And it's actually been around since 2000. And it's voluntary, but a lot of schools participate in it. Actually, over 1,600 colleges and universities participate. Now, it's not only U.S. colleges. It does include colleges in other parts of the world. And it's a very, very detailed survey that's administered to students and those within the institution to see how well a school is engaging its students. And it's a number of things it looks at. But over 5 million people have completed the NASFAA survey. And a lot of research went into this. I got a lot of money from the Pew Foundation, going back into the late 90s to look at student engagement. And it's one of the real qualitative ways of looking at whether a school effectively engages its students. So one of the things I would say would be look up NASFAA data and see if the school participates in it. A lot of times this will be on the institutional research section of the website, and they will share their NASFAA data. And that would be one thing I would say. A second thing I would say is take a look immediately at what their plan is for students from jump, like right from when you're admitted. What is the summer transition plan? Because a lot of times schools that do a really, really good job on support will have a great summer transition plan. And that could be everything from how in-depth is their orientation to what does the advising start. Some schools start advising immediately over the summer. And speaking of advising, a third thing I would say is look at the advising system once you're there. How is it structured? How often do you meet? When do you meet? Do you have multiple advisors? What roles do they play? Another thing is look at the resources that are offered at the Academic Success Center. And different schools have different things, and everybody calls it Academic Success Center, but every school's got some name for their support services that they offer, whether it's writing or tutoring or peer tutoring or, all kinds of different things fall really under that. If a student has learning issues, take a look at the support that's there for learning differences. And I would also look at how the schools are structured residentially. Is the requirement to live on campus first year? Do they have living learning communities? If they do, how are the living learning communities set up? Because a lot of times that can be a really good place for support. Another thing is, do they have freshman seminars, particularly if it's a larger school? That's a movement that's been happening, where schools are having these freshman seminars. It's been going on now for over a decade. But they've realized if we don't get people into these smaller collaborative environments where there's accountability and there's community early on, that people can fall through the cracks. I do like it that Dave acknowledges that you can't just simply look at graduation rates. You can't just simply look at retention rates. While there is some value there, any organization that's having a lot of attrition, you have to ask yourself why. Attrition is never a good sign. But some of these things can be correlated to family income and family resources. And so those are some, I appreciate his acknowledgement of that. But those are my first initial thoughts. So what would you like to add, Lisa?
Well, I think it's a great question. And it's something that I hadn't really considered as much about the student side of the experience. I knew to look at the Career Center. I knew to look at the Learning Center. But this NASFAA report, I think, it's not just the Loch Ness Monster, right? It really tells you a lot of great information.
Yes.
And I think, so my daughter goes to a smaller private school, and I was getting a little disgruntled here and there because, this advisor did not email her back within 48 hours. And then I just happened to talk to some people whose kids were at state schools or larger schools, and they were like, but my kid doesn't have an advisor. When my kid tries to make an appointment with their advisor, and the website says there are no slots available for the rest of the semester. So then I was like, oh, well, maybe I'm kind of being a little bit too hard on the school that we're in, because actually, you might have to wait a little bit, but they are very responsive and try to take care of a lot of things. So I think it's a really important question. I think it can really affect how students experience schools. And I think it's a great thing to try to look at before your kid gets on campus, because it's one of those things that's hard to tell, from just touring the school and talking to even students. They have no frame of reference.
Well, I do want to go back to the last thing you said, because the other thing that I think really, really is important is to talk to as many people as you can and just ask them the questions. And Dave actually sent a follow-up to his question, just to get a little more clarity. And I really like that. And I'm going to read it. It says, how do you narrow down the list of 2,500 schools into a systematic way before you go into a deep dive on evaluating these criteria? And so, I've talked about this before, but, Zemi, I'm a big fan of Zemi, because you can do it right from your computer, and you can go into online communities and start talking to students. The other thing is you can reach out to people from home and set up meetings and interview key people and ask them the tough questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be looking at a lot of different things. I would be looking at the residential life, and how that is structured. I would be looking at academic supports. I would be looking at career center supports. I would be looking at what plan is in place at all for a student that's struggling. Like, these are the kinds of questions that you ask. Like, if a student is struggling, how do you know what triggers Let's just say academically, or you could even broaden it beyond academically. If a student is struggling academically or socially, how do you know if they're struggling, and are you proactive at all? And if you are proactive, what do you do, and what does that look like? Like, that's the kind of question that you can ask every one of your schools and see what you'll get different responses, you know? And I know there's not like just some website that's going to give you a score on that.
Right.
And even if there is, I don't know if I would trust it.
Of course.
And so it does take a little bit of work, but you can do these things from home. Like, you can say, I'd like to set up a conversation and ask a couple questions. Now, obviously, ideally, it would be great if the student did it. That would be ideal. But if the student's not at the point where they're comfortable doing that, this is not something that you should feel ashamed to do as a parent. I wouldn't do it to the admission office as a parent, because the admission office does like to see a student exercise independence. And so it just doesn't make the best impression for your student if you're doing it to the admission office from the parent. I mean, especially from afar. Like, it'd be one thing if a parent asked a question at an info session or on a tour or something like that. That would be different.
Right.
But for a parent to reach out to, and there's a number of people you could reach out to. You could reach out certainly to, academic dean and anything to do with in academics. You could also even reach out to support services, like academic tutoring and success centers, and you could reach out to Res Life. There's a number of people that you could reach out to. Maybe a better question would be, not a better question, that's not a good way of putting it. Maybe an alternative question would be, what would be some really good questions that you would ask if you were to reach out? Mm-hmm. But off the top of my head, the best question that I have is the one that I just mentioned there. Like, how do you know a student is struggling academically or socially? When do you find out? What triggers that? Are you proactive? How are you proactive? And let me paint a picture for me of what that would look like. Or is 100% of everything expected to be on the student? And if they don't, take initiative for everything, then they flunk out. I would just like to ask that open-endedly.
Right.
To your schools, because the really, really good schools that do this stuff, it's a multi-pronged approach. Like, they have very good advising. Even like the RAs are trained to look for signs and to pass on students of concern. Any additional thoughts, Lisa?
Well, I think these are great questions. I think these are really important things to research that people don't think about. I mean, you and I were talking earlier before we recorded about how people focus on status rather than fit. And this is, I think, just equally as important or more important as status, because this is going to determine what your student's day-to-day life is like at that school. And that can make or break a kid in terms of how successful they're going to be in that environment. So I think Dave asked a great question, and I'm glad we're talking about it.
Yeah, because the reality is you're going from a very structured environment in high school to one with an incredible amount of freedom in college.
Right.
You just are. And even if it's like a really large public school, there's still a lot of structure just in your day.
Absolutely.
I mean, you go to college and, one of the things my kids have always done, particularly Joy, she always is really big on arranging her schedule so that she has like Friday off and sometimes Monday off. Like, she'll jam her classes into Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and have, Friday. So you're talking about full days when you're completely on your own, how you handle that time. And that's one of the reasons why we've made recommendation of a lot of different books, whether it's the Freshman Survival Guide or, The Naked Roommate or others as well in our recommended resource section that have dealt with handling this transition from all of this structure to all of this freedom. And there are a lot of people that I work with that are really concerned with how their kid is going to handle that. I mean, I'd say at least 1 in every 10 families that I work with, that's a big concern. Like,
yes.
My kid will get eaten alive if they just go into this big environment with large classes. The professor doesn't expect to get to know the students. A lot of partying going on, a lot of distractions, Like that could just be like one big giant vacuum cleaner just sucking them up. And I don't want to blow $50,000 or $30,000 or whatever the amount you're paying. I don't want to blow that. And also I don't want to see my child get off course. So that's why I like this question, because I sort of felt like Dave was speaking for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, he brings up a great point.
Awesome. All right. We got a second question from a student.
Yes, this is from Caitlin. And Caitlin asks, I attend a small private school, and 2 students from my school have already committed to Duke for athletics. Is that going to hurt my chances of getting in? Would they take them more than 2 kids from one really small school?
Another great question. And, this can be very nuanced, but if I was just to answer it in one word, I would say yes, they will. I mean, in 2019, I spent some time at Harvard. I was going through their Harvard certification program for counselors. And I was talking to the dean at Harvard Admissions, and he was telling me about 10 kids that they took recently from this last incoming year from a local school. And I can't remember if it was BB&N or Roxbury Latin. These are a couple of Boston schools. But 6 of them were athletic recruits. There were a couple hockey players. There was lacrosse in there. I can't remember what the other 3 sports were, but I remember I took note in my mind 6 of the 10 were hockey players. I mean, not hockey. 6 of the 10 were athletes. And the way schools think is it's about their needs. And so if a student is meeting their needs and their institutional priorities, they're going to take them. And 10 may be a lot for like one school, but of course it depends on the size of the school, right? This is all relevant. Like really big schools, of course, take more. But taking more than 2 is not uncommon at all. Mm-hmm. This also goes back to the conversation I've had before about people getting put into buckets. Like, and so if you're not in the same bucket as somebody else, it's almost like you don't count, if that makes any sense. Like, so 2 athletes, those are 2 separate kids that if you're coming in purely off of the strength of, your academic record and your interests, you're not really being compared to those athletes. Now, the reason why I gave a little nuance to it is I don't want to pretend that the conversation about schools being diverse and who they take their applicants from isn't also real. And schools are facing a lot of pressure not to take so many kids from private schools. Read the explosive article in The Atlantic on this that listed all the statistics of how many, what percentage of kids from private schools, end up going to some of these schools and how much higher it is than the population at large and how it's unfair. And there's a lot of commotion and a lot of pressure on schools right now to diversify from private to more public and, and charter and homeschool and other alternative schools. And you've heard me talk about this a lot, Lisa. Admissions is just a collection of individuals who bring their own individual biases and their own perspectives to how they read a file. And so it would be naive to not say that there could be somebody in the admissions committee that could say, we've already taken 2 kids from this school. We haven't taken anybody from this school over here in 10 years. And so I'm not going to say that could never happen. In fact, chances are in a larger, depending on the size of how many people are involved in voting on a decision, that there's probably going to be somebody that feels that way. But the overall preponderance is that if you have something and you're meeting the needs of a school, they don't have quotas on we can't take more than 2 or 3 or 4. And so I shared the example of taking double digits. Mm-hmm. I worked very closely with Milton Academy. One year they had 12 kids go to Harvard. But they're in different buckets. Some of them were athletic recruits. Some of them were alumni. Some of them were faculty kids. Some of them were just, geniuses in math and science or had some other extraordinary gift they were bringing or unique forms of diversity. And all of those kids are kind of not really competing with each other. Like you're more likely to compete with somebody in your bucket than you are just to compete with somebody who's in your same school. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So I hope that Caitlin's bucket is a good one, and I hope it works out for her. It's such an unpredictable process, and it's so hard for kids. I mean, you can just see the anxiety in this question.
Exactly. You're right. Yeah. And as a psychologist, you don't miss that. It never escapes you, the anxiety, which is good that you don't miss that. No, you can hear the anxiety. And so I would absolutely say is that should not be a reason why you don't apply to Duke.
Right.
You should not apply to Duke because you think I'm dead on arrival because they've already taken two kids from my school. I just have so many examples of this. I remember, one time, we had gone years and had not gotten a student in a particular school. I mentioned the school, and then we got 4 1 year, bang.
Mm-hmm.
But if you looked at those 4, they were all very different, and they basically they were not in similar buckets. They were not really competing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who are not following what I'm talking about, I probably should just make a little reference to it because, sometimes I think, Lisa, I kind of assume everybody's heard every single episode and they've retained every single thing, and that's not true, right?
Well, no one. It's impossible. There's too much information.
Yeah. So if anybody missed that, so at schools that do holistic admissions are basically engaged in social engineering. They and I know that word has a pejorative connotation, but they have in their mind an idea of what a balanced class is. And they're trying to achieve that balanced class. And they're trying to fulfill multiple institutional priorities. And so when they look at an applicant, they're looking at you through the prism of, could you be one of the stronger people in our applicant this year for that particular area? Now, what are some of those things? There's a lot of things, of course, right? So certainly geographically, they're trying to get as close to 50 states as they possibly can. They're trying to get as many countries as they possibly can. Athletes and highly talented artists, whether it's, music or in different types of music. It could be the orchestra, it could be the band. I mean, those are all priorities, drama, film, different categories related to that. Then you've got majors. That's a big one, especially for a lot of schools. You need to have a certain number of people in certain majors. And then you're trying to have some semblance of gender balance. Gender can be an issue. You're certainly looking at your residential living on campus and not living on campus population. For state schools, a lot of times they're looking at in-state versus out-of-state, especially if they have state legislative mandates that have to do with how many in-state or out-of-state they have to take. Then they're looking at things like racial and ethnic diversity. Then they're looking at, things like development admits, people that can build the buildings and do those kinds of things. Some additional common buckets can be first generation, rural diversity, alumni kids. Now, some colleges will differentiate between general alums and very active alums who are significant contributors, and some will define that by financial gifts and some just active involvement like interviewer and that kind of thing. Very high testers for schools that want to elevate their test scores, valedictorians, class presidents, for those who put this in their promotional material. Celebrity kids who can bring a lot of publicity, positive publicity to the school. So when I say buckets, I'm talking about really kind of apples and oranges. You aren't necessarily competing with those kids directly, although I kind of stretched a few of those buckets. Most schools aren't slicing the pie that thin. And so there's a lot of different categories, and I didn't even touch on all of them. I just mentioned some of the more common ones that can put you into a particular bucket. And then the question is, you can be like, the kid from Utah that, like we don't have any girls from Utah this year. So how do you compare to the other girls from Utah? Or, we're really, really, really working on growing this new data science major that we have. And, we've hired like 12 new professors. Or, we're concerned that we're going to have to phase out our German department completely or lay off some professors because hardly anybody's expressing any interest in German. This is a student that's expressing interest in German, or Russian or whatever. And so that could be great because we need more students in that area. And so, It's more about that's, we call it institutional priorities, but it's also buckets. And so you get put into a different bucket, and kids be in multiple different buckets. And if you're in multiple different buckets, then you're not really competing with that other kid from your school, because it's more seen through the prism of what are the needs of the colleges. I had a family say to me just yesterday, their son's applying to a super, super, super highly competitive school. And she said to me, are my chances going to be great? Because I've found out from talking to, it's also a smaller private school, but talking to the counselor and some other people, that my son's the only person that's applying early to this one school. And I kind of said, well, that's not really that relevant, because it's more about the needs of the college than it is. Like, they're not just thinking about one school.
Right.
Now, does that ever play a role? Sometimes. Like, there's times when schools have traditional feeders and they would not like to not take anybody from their traditional feeders, as long as they send somebody that's competent and meets the need, and they'd like to keep that continuity going. Or there's times when, I remember these conversations. We haven't taken anybody from this school in 5 years. Like, we're going to lose them as a referral source. It's going to dry up if we don't. This is a term we used to use. We got to throw them a bone, So sometimes these things can play a role in terms of, like, you being seen as somebody from that school that can keep the referrals coming, because we've kept that school happy. But in this context, taking 3 students from 4 students, no, that absolutely can happen all the time. Now, what's unlikely to happen is 4 or 5 kids from the same school in the same bucket. But hate to get even more complex, but even that's possible. Because let's say the bucket is you're a football recruit. If you're good enough to help the team, they'll be happy to take 4 or 5 from the same school. It's more about the needs of the institution. That's the bottom line I want people to remember. It's more about the needs of the institution than anything else. Any final comments, Lisa?
Well, I think that's really something especially to keep in mind now as decisions are starting to come out, is it's not really personal. It's about the needs of the school. It's not about like a judgment whether you're a good or bad student or worthy or not worthy. You could be the most amazing student, but they already, filled your bucket with somebody else. And that's just the way it is. And it has nothing to do with your worth. So just keep that in mind.
I'm glad you said that, because it reminded me of something I like to say, and I don't think I've said it this year on the podcast. I put it out on Twitter and it got a good response, but I don't think I've said it here, and I want to say it, which is, it's important to remember, if you don't get into school, they didn't reject you because they don't really know you. They just know you on paper. They only know you a little bit on paper. They know you from writing maybe 500 words, 200 words here. Couple teachers said a few things, if there were even teacher recommendations, a transcript. I think you're so much more complex than that. And it's a good thing to remind yourself, if you don't get in the schools that you apply to, is they didn't really reject me because they don't really know me. All they know is just a little smattering of me on paper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So awesome. All right. See you next week, Lisa.
Bye.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Okay, friends, hopefully you've enjoyed the series that we've had with Courtney and Michael as they've answered questions you sent in. And we're on our final part. And in part 5, Courtney and Michael continue the discussion about common mistakes they see a lot of students make on both the FAFSA and the profile. Michael finishes up the FAFSA, and then he transitions to the profile. And then Courtney shares the most common mistakes she experienced, both when she did financial aid and now that she's a director of college counseling. Courtney and Michael also answer the question, are you experiencing more schools requiring the FAFSA for merit aid than the past? And then Courtney answers this question, if my student will be starting college in the fall, I have heard that we should go and pay for the first 2 years and use very little of our 529 so we can avoid taxes. Is that good financial strategy or not? And finally, of course, I'm not going to have 2 guests come on and let them get off without being on the hot seat. So I go a little easy on them because we had a 90-minute interview. Figured I'd cut them a little slack. Gave each one 3 or 4 questions, and we learned a little bit about them outside of them as professionals. Listen and enjoy.
Another area that that it's important to be careful with is assets. Who does that asset belong to? Does it belong to the student or does it belong to the parent? With most financial aid calculations, the calculation is much more harsh on a student asset than it is on a parent asset. So you want to be sure you get that correct. You don't want to incorrectly report a parent-owned 529 plan as a student asset. The student's the beneficiary of that, but really the parent is still the owner of that. So it's a parent asset. So be careful on the asset side. And then I think about the FAFSA, particularly in comparison to the profile, where the FAFSA is going to ask for less information than the CSS profile. So things you want to be sure to not include on the FAFSA are the primary home. So that does not go on the FAFSA. You certainly don't report any retirement assets on the FAFSA, and if you own a business, if it's a small and family-owned business, you don't need to report that on the FAFSA. And the one other thing to be careful of is if you do own other real estate, whether it's a cabin in the mountains or or on the beach, or if it's a rental property you own and you have some income from it, is you want to only report the equity, not the value of that property, but the equity, the value minus the debt. Only the equity is what you need to report on the FAFSA. And so that then the profile asks for questions a little bit differently, just to keep it interesting. So the profile, you do report your primary home, and the CSS profile also wants to know about any kind of business you own, small business, family owned, big business, whatever it is that they want to know about the business. And so you can expect that if you're filling out both the FAFSA and the profile, that some of the questions will be a little bit different. And so just watching those questions as you go through.
That was great. I know one mistake I see is students including, or not students, well, sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's students, oftentimes parents, but putting the home value as an asset. And so it goes into the asset calculator, even that it says on the FAFSA I'm talking about, particularly not the profile, even that, it says not to do it, but I think they just think of it as an asset and they miss that. Anything else you want to add to that, Courtney, that you see?
Honestly, my first reaction was spelling your name, the correct date of birth, and the correct social security number. That is honestly the most, in my whole career, that's the most common. Whenever I volunteer to help people fill out FAFSAs, we take the most time on that FSAID part and the least time on the FAFSA. Because if you mess it up, it just creates a whole slew of issues. But the other one I'll say, and Michael alluded to, part of the untaxed income is a lot of families. There's a specific question about voluntary tax-deferred retirement contributions. And I don't blame anyone for being confused. That's a mouthful. But it means there's a very specific part on your W-2 that shows how much you personally voluntarily elected to contribute to your own retirement, not what the employer contributed or not what the match was if you get one. Many families forget or don't know what that is and don't put it in. And then when the financial aid calculates, it is included as income. Which I believe, don't quote me, but I think this is going to change in a few years. But for now, for the next year or two, it's remember to add that in. And that also can mess up net price calculators. The final one is on the CSS profile. I have seen this really hurt students. There's a question about scholarships received. I don't remember the exact wording, but I had a specific situation where a student hoped to receive $25,000 in scholarship.
Ouch.
Yes, she put that in. And the school that was her dream school admitted her with no aid, even though she clearly needed it. And it took a long, drawn-out fight to convince them, like, this was a mistake, this money doesn't exist. So be very careful filling out that expected scholarship question.
Wow, great answer, both of you. I'm going to sneak one more quick one in on my own, and then the last question, and then it's the hot seat. So I am noticing it seems like more schools are requiring the FAFSA for merit aid. Are you seeing that at all, Courtney?
I am hearing and seeing it in like the professional networks. I have not seen or heard it through my own experience helping students.
I had one school say to me, and Michael, you probably know, like the more FAFSAs a school gets, the more work study money they're able to tap into from the government. Have either one of you heard that?
I've heard that.
Yeah.
There's a complicated calculation that goes into that, and to be honest, I have not dived into that. I mean, a lot of the information is reported on the FISAP report that the colleges all have to submit that talks about a couple different types of federal aid, and but I haven't, to be honest, I have not dived into the calculation within the FISAP that helps determine a college's allocation for work study, but. So I don't know.
Michael Runewitz from WashU told me that that's one reason schools like to gather as many FAFSAs is they can actually offer more work study aid. So keep an eye on that, because there's people that say, well, I'm not going to qualify for financial aid, so I can just ignore all this stuff. But they're still maybe hoping to get merit. And quite a few more schools every year are requiring it for merit.
And I don't think it's a bad thing either, because you never know what is going to happen to your family. And some schools say if you don't apply in your first year, you won't be able to apply later.
That's true.
And the other thing is, I mean, for some families, you might want to consider, like, I hate this term. I feel like it's overused in financial aid, but you might want the student to have some skin in the game and like take out a loan and know what that's like. That's also a way for the student to build their own credit history by taking out a student loan.
But you know what? You really brought out an important point, Courtney. There are some schools that say if you don't apply first year, you can't apply. And so you might think, well, we're flush with money, and then you lose your job. So that can be a good reason to at least apply your first year to do at least complete a FAFSA for that reason alone. Have you heard that much, Michael, that schools having that policy?
Yeah. I mean, there are certainly schools that do that, or they maybe, in some cases maybe all 4 years, but maybe some cases just for the first 2 years or something like that, and that's really about you're always eligible for federal financial aid, certainly, but that's really around institutional need-based aid.
Sure.
So there are certainly schools that do that.
All right. The last question. This is for you, Courtney. If my student will be starting college in the fall of 2022, I have heard that we should pay as we go for the first 2 years and use very little of our 529. The reason for this is that colleges use your prior year taxes for FAFSA, because if we wait for the last 2 years to use the money for the 529, it will not have any tax impact because you will have completed by then. So basically what I'm saying is, can we use a lump sum toward his college now and it not be held against us? That was a mouthful.
Yeah, and this question, I did have to do some research, and this is where any financial aid person will say, well, I am not a tax professional and I'm not a certified financial advisor. But there are certain things we do know. And I would say, based on my knowledge and my brief research, I think the opposite is the case here, where it's better to hold off spending down your... Oh, wait, no, sorry. And maybe I didn't misunderstand, because the question was that they wanted to spend down in the beginning or in the end of college, the 529.
They're trying to sort of shield the 529 money from showing up with prior year when it won't make any difference. Yes, when it won't make any difference.
I did understand. Yeah, so it will not show up as income. That's one of the benefits of a 529. And I should say federal income tax. So 529 withdrawals or interest earned are not counted as income for federal tax purposes. But in my research, I saw it alluded that there are some states that may count it as state tax income. So again, this is where I can't say I'm an expert on which states might do that, but I know for federal, it's not counted. However, I know that 529s are counted as an asset for financial aid purposes. Unlike income, assets are counted on the day you complete the financial aid application. They are not counted as a prior asset amount. So if a family thinks they're going to have significant enough cash flow, I honestly think it's better, but there's not a huge difference. It's better to spend down the 529 in the first year or two, because it's not going to show up as income. And college financial aid offices, I think people don't realize they're usually not tracking like the tuition paid, the source of it. Like they don't get that information, and that would be a lot of work to track for a college and communicate back and forth. So they just give the financial aid award, and then the business or the billing or the bursar's office collects the money. So the reason why I think it might not even be worth it to do this in the first place is because income counts for so much more in financial aid than assets do. The calculation is both for a school that uses this FAFSA and profile, they count up to 45% of your income as available to pay for college in 1 year. And it's up to. I don't want listeners to be like, oh my God, they're going to take 45% of all my income. So the higher your income, the higher that percentage creeps up gradually. And vice versa. The lower your income, the lower that goes. So for assets, they only count up to 6% of assets as available for college per year. And the same thing goes where the less income, the less assets they count, the higher the income, the higher the assets they count. So if you use your 529 up in the first couple of years, it won't be on your financial aid. In the last 2 years, it might make a tiny difference. And I don't know if Michael has anything to add to this one.
Yeah, I mean, those are. Oof. I mean, I think your opener that we are not tax experts is certainly always the place to begin. so that's very, very, very good place to start. It's an interesting thing. I mean, I think that, it all depends on the numbers. I mean, how much do you have in your 529 plan? How much do you owe the college? And thinking about those things. Often, more broadly, I think about using resources from a variety of places. I mean, as you look at the 4 years. And so, I mean, I think it's important also for families to remain agile over those 4 years, because you don't necessarily know what's going to happen, what may change. If your student's gonna decide they want to transfer somewhere else, that's gonna really open up a big change for them potentially. So in my mind, I try to remain agile. And so for me, what that means is taking money from a variety of places potentially. So using some of the 529 plan money, maybe having a student take out a student loan because the interest is subsidized, or it's a low interest loan. So really looking at using a variety of sources just to give the student and the family as much flexibility over those 4 years as possible. So it's finding that balance, I think, is important.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, I teased this out in the interview, but my recommended resource for episode 206 is the NASFAA Off the Cuff podcast. Now, this podcast is for people who like to nerd out, geek out on the financial changes that are being contemplated. It isn't the place to get questions and answers to your paying for college questions like I'm doing with Michael and Courtney here. It's really the place to get answers to questions like, what is going on with the renewal of the Higher Education Act? Will legislation to double the Pell Grant get through Congress? What are Biden's educational initiatives, and what are the Democrats and Republicans going to do in Congress? What were the highlights of the annual Department of Education conference? What is the latest on the COVID-19 relief fund? They really focus on how federal legislation impacts the cost of college. NASFAA is an acronym that stands for the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. The podcast is a lot of professional development for FinAid administrators, but it's also for anyone who just likes to geek out on trends and legislation impacting the cost of college. We will now return to our final segment in our interview, where your questions you sent in about paying for college are answered. Listen, Michael and Courtney, this has been awesome. It's been long overdue. We've had several people ask us to do it, and so when we did it, we go big or go home. We did it, and we dove in, and I think this is something, if our listeners like, we can do it again in the future. But you don't escape without getting off the hot seat. You're both podcast listeners. You know how this works. Ladies first. Courtney, what is your favorite type of food?
Oh, I'm a big eater. I often say if I had to eat one thing for the rest of my life, it would be donuts.
What's your favorite type of donut? Let's go there.
Oh boy. I honestly like the plain cake donut. A really good fried. Really? Yes, I love it.
Do you have a brand preference, like Krispy Kreme or one of those kind of things?
Well, we like anything local. So there's this like tiny little shack up across the border in Vermont that does them like fresh hot donuts on the weekend. I wish there's not a lot of donut places in Western Mass. I think there should be more. maybe I'll quit this whole thing
There you
and do that now.
Don't do that. Michael, what is your favorite type of music to listen to?
Oh boy, you're asking me the hard questions. So, so I have to say, I spent a little time in my, some of those adventuresome years in Montana, and it really directed me into some country music, which I have to say, and my daughter Emily, she discovered that also, totally separate, not influenced by me, and so I certainly listen to country music with my daughter periodically.
Cool. Courtney, bucket list question. What's the place you haven't been to, but you're determined to get there some point in your life?
Oh, another good one. I always say, gosh, I can't pick. I do say South Africa a lot because, I just would love to go there. It seems beautiful. I worked for a woman who was from there and is back there now that I could visit. And I'm actually working with a student now who's about to graduate who's from there. But I would also say Ireland because I have a lot of family roots in Ireland and it would be cool to go there.
That's where my oldest daughter is right now, Dublin. Just took a trip because she's the Miss World Traveler. Why not? Enjoy yourself at 25. Awesome. Yep, she's in Dublin. Michael, your favorite sport to watch on TV?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. I joke a fair bit with my boss at Smith because he's a fan of hockey and a number of other things, and I usually have to clarify when he mentions a particular sports team that I'm talking about the right actual sport. So unfortunately, I don't watch a lot of sports typically, although so I would have to say is when the Olympics come up every few years that's certainly one of my favorite things to do is to spend time watching most Olympic sports. I find really fun and exciting. Particularly, I think I'd say particularly some of the track events.
Yeah, that was my thing. I love track and field in the Olympics. There's nothing like it. Courtney, and money's no issue. You could drive any car. What would you buy?
A car. Oh, that's funny. My husband and I have a hobby lately of looking up really like vehicles from the 80s that are like completely redone. So I'm trying to think of a funny example we've seen. Oh, I don't know, like an old Ford Bronco that's been tricked out to be like a camping thing. Yeah,
That's
like
creative.
we like vintage vehicles, I should say.
Cool. So I'm going to close this out with a question I like to ask everybody. I'll ask each of you. You can go first, Michael, then Courtney. What is your best advice I'll let you pick, students or parents or both, whatever you want to share. Leave us with some sage wisdom.
Ooh, yeah, that's good. I think my best advice, this whole process is to really know that there are so many colleges across the U.S. and across the world, and just so many wonderful opportunities. It's such an exciting time. And as best as one can to try to remove the anxiety and the fear around that, and knowing that there is not just one good fit for every student, that there are many good fits for each student, and that the experience you have at the college where you end up, so much of that is the experience that you create and the way that you interact with that college. And so it's great to get excited about an individual college, but really, as best as you can, keep an open mind and look at the variety of schools that are out there, and know that there are many good fits for each of you.
And, we never talked about this, but Michael has a child that just went through this whole process. So you got a chance to put that in action, Michael.
That's right. That is right.
Courtney, your final words?
Everything Michael said. And since he didn't focus on the financial, so he gave the college counselor answer, in my opinion, I'll give the financial answer of really talk openly about money as a family, starting as soon as you can. I'm a big believer in, just like as transparent and as open as possible, because it's not something to be scared about, or it's a tool that we all need to use to live the lives we want to live. And the earlier we can help our children know that, or young people in general, and learn how to use it is. And I will say, like, don't be afraid of loans, especially in undergrad, because I should say federal loans. Don't be afraid of federal loans. Be a little more afraid of private loans.
Right.
Because federal loans are made to that you're not going to overborrow. And I borrowed a little over the average of my undergrad, and then I borrowed a little more for my graduate school. And yeah, it was, there are certain life choices I've made that I maybe would have made differently if I didn't have the student debt, but I paid it off. My husband and I both paid ours off. I'll say the numbers. We had a combined total of like $89,000 between us, and we paid it off in 2018. And we, we still have a child and had pets and have a house that we own and cars that we've paid off. So life is, and we don't come from money. Let me be clear. We don't come from piles of money. So yeah, I just want to tell families, like, it's not an all or nothing. There's, like Michael said, there's multiple sources and ways to do this, and it's going to be okay in the end if you talk about it and know what you're doing.
Listen, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate both of you. And thank you so much for taking your time to help out all of our listeners and being listeners yourself and giving feedback on the podcast. I really appreciate both of you, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. Friends, very excited to be back with an addendum with Courtney to our final segment. And we didn't kick Michael to the curb. We're just recording this right around New Year's, and we didn't want to bother him during his New Year's break. But first of all, Happy New Year, Courtney.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you, too. Yay, 2022.
2022. Let's hope it's better than 2021. Of course, with COVID, it's kind of hard to hope for not to be.
Yeah.
But Courtney reached out and, and I was glad she did this. She said, you know what, just there's some things I never said I really, really wanted to share. And I said, well, you want to write me up a paragraph and I can read it, or do you want to just record a segment? She said, let's record a segment. And so that's what you're going to hear today. So Courtney, go ahead and share what's on your heart.
Sure. So after I ended our conversation last time, I realized I said what I said about student loans and how you shouldn't be scared of them. And I didn't really qualify that exactly the way I wanted to, because there's so many different types of loans out there for education. So what I really meant was, don't be afraid of the federal student loans, because they do have really specific limits, which I think Michael or you had talked about already. And they're really low limits. So right now, I think the average a student graduating, if they took out the maximum student loans as a dependent student, I think the average is only like $31,000.
Well, that 31,000 is actually over 5 years. That's if you get a fifth or sixth year, it's 31. If you do 4 years, it's actually 27. Mm-hmm. And so like 67.50 average a year. Yeah,
which is really I mean, if you're going to college to ideally get a full-time job with a full-time salary, that's really reasonable to start out with, if you have to do that. The loans that I really want to be clear are to be afraid of are parent plus loans, or just parent loans in general. A lot of colleges sometimes include them in the award letter, assuming like, oh, the family will qualify for the credit check and then borrow all this other money to cover whatever gap in funding or whatever parent contribution they can't come up with already. So parent loans can quickly and easily get out of hand. They can interfere with a family's ability to retire when they want to, because you can't borrow for retirement and you can borrow for education. And the other type of loan that I wasn't clear also are graduate level loans. So a lot of, and this also, there's even higher limits on the parent loans and the graduate loans. And if you're doing a health profession, there's even higher limits on those at the federal level. So the interest rates are still better for those health profession loans, but still, like, the amount of money some students can graduate with beyond that undergraduate federal capped student loan for dependent students, that's where all the news is about, $1 trillion in loans and all that.
I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because quite a few times in the podcast I have mentioned I'm comfortable, with a federal direct student loan as oftentimes a maximum for students for undergrad, unless they're going into a higher paid profession. But what I haven't said is that is undergrad. If you look at the federal direct maximum for grad school, it's about triple the undergrad max. And then there's the grad plus, which can be much more, right? They can look at cost of attendance. It can go up pretty high. I've looked at the default rates, and what really has gotten people in trouble, especially with the really high loan debt, has been a lot of the federal grad stuff because of how high those loan limits are. And if you start a program and drop out, or you start a program and then you're either unemployed or underemployed, and that's what leads to this huge crisis that we have right now. So I don't think we've ever, because we're so focused on undergrad, thinking you're a college-bound kid. We're probably talking to parents of 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. But our recent questionnaire showed 29.6% of our parents have somebody in college right now, which makes sense because you have kids at different ages. You might be thinking about your 17-year-old, but that doesn't mean you don't have a 20 or 21-year-old. And so they can very much be thinking of grad school, grad loans. So I think it's really good that you drew that distinction. And so what's your advice on Parent Plus loans, Courtney? Because I used to say just don't do them, period, because of the things that you mentioned. Most people haven't prepared for their retirement, and they have higher origination fees and higher interest rates. And then, you learn from your students, right? And so I have had some people that just did them anyway, and in a couple of cases, they didn't necessarily regret it. So I've modified my stance a little. Now I say run those monthly calculators so you can see, okay, if it's $190 a month, maybe we can swing that. And don't just go in there and just do them willy-nilly. Run it in your budget. And if it's a very modest amount, I've gotten comfortable, although I would never do them myself, so I'm opposed to doing them, but I've kind of taken that stance. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I've heard you talk about it before as a really personal decision. When I advise families, I also err on the side of do whatever you can to avoid them. And also, like you said, run calculators on not just on the loan amount you're borrowing and what that looks like monthly, but on, expected salaries for the student upon graduating and what your expected possible retirement income could be. I also encourage comparing, because some states like Massachusetts have higher education nonprofits. I'm using the air quotes because they are sort of technically a nonprofit, but they do a lot of good. So I'm going to shout out MIFA, Massachusetts Educational Finance Authority. They serve mainly families who live or students who attend this college in Massachusetts, but other colleges have similar, where they give free advice, they have online resources, but they also offer loans that are parent loans. And they can be comparable to Parent Plus, and they sometimes can be more favorable. I also ask families to, if they are a homeowner, compare, is it worth it to borrow any home equity? Kind of compare those three options and see which one, especially before you even think about private loans and going beyond Parent Plus.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Because in some cases, home equity, line of credits, you are putting your home at risk, but sometimes those rates are so much lower that it's something to consider. Expand on why you're not a big fan of private loans. It's really started, my first job in financial aid at Mass College of Pharmacy was before they put federal laws and regulations into place that prevented private loan companies from basically soliciting colleges. So we would really only push Sallie Mae brand loans, which don't exist anymore. And Sallie Mae would send us a giant box of chocolates every Christmas. Right.
But I could see, because we were at a pharmacy school, so the students who were in the pharmacy program were probably going to be fine, but it was a health science school also. And it really pained me sometimes to have families dealing with this gap in pay, taking out thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for a degree that nobody was really sure which direction they would go for certain. And so that's my personal experience with them. But in general terms, I think the private loans, they are run by outside banks. They can do whatever they want in terms of interest rates, in terms of the rules and regulations for repayment. Usually I've heard the customer service is really not that great. And they can start out looking really great, with a low interest rate, but maybe it's a
variable.
Yeah, variable. Maybe it's variable and it's going to jump up. And you can just get really stuck and bogged down dealing with them forever. And, like for all this loan repayment we're hearing about, if anything like that ever actually happens, it's probably not going to include private loans.
No, definitely not. I mean, an example is if you look at the interest on federal loans has been frozen now for a long time, because of the pandemic. And it was just extended again till May. And so there's no way private loans are going to do that because they are for-profit businesses. And so there's a few things they just cannot compete with. They cannot offer any type of like forbearance and deferment. And usually you don't have the flexible loan repayment options. Like it is nice with the federal loan that, they're pretty flexible if you lose, you're unemployed, underemployed. And I mean, the interest can still accrue. And then like you said, there's talk right now. Who knows if it's going to happen? I wouldn't bank on it, but Will there be any loan cancellation? There's all kinds of proposals out there. I was listening to a financial aid podcast I listen to sometimes, which I probably need to do as a recommended resource for people that are really hard core into this. But one proposal out there by a really sharp guy is that the interest would be forgiven. So that it would, in fact, you take the federal loans and make them 0% loans, which would really help because what really hurts when these loan balances get high a lot is just the interest is still accruing. And then people feel like, wow, I'm just sinking. Like, how am I ever going to pay this thing off? Like, just the interest alone is making the balances go up.
Yeah. In terms of graduate versus undergrad, another thing I think people don't realize is I think in 2010 or 2011, they stopped giving subsidized graduate loans. I was actually one of the last people that got to use them, which was
wow,
nice
good for you.
Yeah. But yeah, so anything you borrow for graduate is never going to be subsidized loans.
You know what? Not everybody may know what that means, Courtney. Tell the difference between subsidized and unsubsidized for our listeners.
So subsidized versus unsubsidized. Subsidized means it's a loan that comes with no accruing interest while the student is in school, at least part-time, which usually means like at least 2 classes. And it's usually carried over for a little bit after the student leaves school, and then the interest begins accruing. Unsubsidized loans are loans where the interest immediately begins accruing. And the student has the choice to pay off that interest while they're in school to kind of, benefit them when repayment begins. And subsidized, the way you get them, you can't unfortunately choose. It is based on the federal formula for financial need and whether or not you have the need for a loan that is technically interest-free while you're in school.
Yeah, so like to give an example, if someone had $20,000 in subsidized loan at the time they took it out, then you start paying your loans back, assuming you don't drop below half-time status or you don't drop out, you start paying your loans back 6 months after graduation. So your balance would be $20,000. Even if you took a loan out 4 years ago, it's $20,000. Where with the unsub, your interest is on the clock right away. And for both Parent Plus as well as, the grad plus loans and the federal loans on the grad level, you start on you're on the interest clock immediately. And so if you take out $20,000, it's not $20,000 by the time you start making payments. So that's the difference. And with large numbers, it can add up. Now, I appreciate you coming on here and saying this because Parent Plus loans can get people in so much trouble. And some schools are pretty tricky and sneaky with how they put them onto the aid awards. And a lot of times it's not clear that it is even a loan. And then the other thing with Parent Plus loans, people don't realize you do have to qualify for them. I realize it's not like a stringent credit check, right? They're looking at whether you've had, certain incidents.
I think on-time payments for 90 days at least. I think something like that.
Yeah, but then all the other things too, like, foreclosures and repossessions and all those kinds of things. You have to have avoided bankruptcies, like sort of those financial calamities. But one thing that can happen to somebody is they can take out a Parent Plus 1 year and then not qualify for their next year.
Right.
And then you're in trouble. Your kid has to pull out and then you have the loans and you have no degree.
Well, the only good thing sort of about a parent not qualifying is the student then qualifies for extra unsubsidized loans. Not a lot. I think it's around
4,000.
4,000.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is a little trick that you can use. Yeah.
So any parent who immediately thinks like, I'm never going to qualify, you should still apply, because that's the only way the student will get the extra.
Yeah, you can get 4,000 more in undergraduate loan, but hopefully this wasn't too complex. We just wanted to add a little addendum to the loan conversation, because irresponsible loan borrowing really, really can put the student and a parent in jeopardy for like not just years, sometimes even decades. So thanks, Courtney.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and all that good stuff. And we'll see you. Courtney's in our counseling group too. So for those of you who are in our counseling group, we have a financial aid expert as part of our group, which we're excited.
Yeah, I'm excited about that group.
Yep. See you February 6th at our next meeting.
Next week in the news, the number of college graduates in the humanities drops for the 8th consecutive year. An article by Jill Barchet of the Hechinger Report. Our question from our listener is, why would Connecticut College tell a 3.9 student who submitted a 1320 on the SAT that they will admit him if he switches to the test optional track? That comes from Gus from Massachusetts and Ari from California. Our interview is with Linda Debker, a parent and a podcast listener from Missouri, who shares how parents can find out about the experience of college through social media and what it will be like for their child. That will be part 1 of 2. And our college spotlight is Sewanee, the University of the South, or in Sewanee, Tennessee.
I'm really excited, Dave, about the conversation we're going to have next week. It'll be with Lisa. But social media just went berserk, abrupt with, a parent who literally posted online. And I actually had a parent forward me their social media post. Why would Connecticut College reach out to me and say, we'll accept your child as long as they withhold their test scores and apply as a test non-submitter? And then John Bachestat, we know how he feels about the test. He got involved. He's always throwing flames and breaking glass. And it became this whole, uproarious scene on social media. And the great thing about our listeners, they always reach out to me about stuff like this. So it kind of keeps me in the pulse of things if I miss something. And so we're going to talk about this next week. Like, why would schools do this? Is this good? Is this bad? Does this reveal the fact that schools are just self-serving? They only think about themselves? Are there other perspectives? What's the school perspective? What's the student perspective? We're going to have a really good, fun conversation on that. So stay tuned next week for that. See you later, my friend.
Take care, and wear your mask and keep your head up.
Yeah, and once again, everybody, Happy New Year. We're starting out 2022 with our first episode, and we're excited and looking for big things this year. And thank you, guys. We call you our listening family for a reason. And that's a special term, by the way, designed for people that don't miss an episode. According to our questionnaire, 58% of our listeners never miss an episode. And so That's who we regard as our listening family. And hopefully as a family together, we'll make 2022 better than 2021.
Have yourself a very Merry Christmas and
you're not going to sing, are you?
Yeah.
I thought you were about to break out a tune.
I was going to rap, but that's going to be worse.
No, please. I'll break my mic.
That's right.
That'll be worse than you playing basketball in front of the JV coach at Princeton.
Yeah, we won't go through that again. Happy New Year, everybody.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please subscribe so you get every episode as soon as it is released. If you are interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. And you can write a review for us on your favorite podcast listening app. I am the producer of the Your College Bound Kid podcast. We have a fantastic team of 9 people. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. David Williams and Dr. Lisa Ruff. Our sound engineer who fixes all of our many errors is Nemanja Motvich. The amazing music you hear is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Dalianas Dimitri. If you want to have a college coaching session with me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want to ask, or a college you want Lisa or me to do a spotlight on, or if you have a recommended resource or an article you think we should share, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you, our family, next week.